The air in the ancient vault beneath the ruins of Rennes-le-Château was cold, damp, and heavy, with the scent of aged stone and something else, something indefinable, like the faint echo of memories encoded in blood and bone across countless generations. A single, slender beam of moonlight filtered through a precisely aligned aperture that marked the summer solstice, illuminated a sealed stone sarcophagus that dominated the center of the hidden chamber. Upon its surface, carved in symbols that merged Hebrew, Egyptian, and patterns that belonged to no known civilization, was an inscription that made the very air seem to vibrate with suppressed power. Here lies the testament of she who carried the bloodline unbroken from the last days of the first world to the dawn of the new covenant. Before this sarcophagus, a lone figure knelt, their hands trembling as they traced the unfamiliar symbols, feeling beneath their fingertips not just carved stone, but something deeper, a resonance that seemed to awaken something dormant in their own cells. From the depths of the earth itself, a low, resonant hum began to emanate, a frequency that vibrated not through the air, but through the body, through the blood, through the ancient memory carried in DNA itself. What if Mary Magdalene was not merely the companion of Jesus, or even his spiritual equal, but the carrier of a genetic and spiritual lineage that traced back to the lost civilization of Atlantis, a bloodline deliberately preserved through millennia, because it held the key to human consciousness transformation? And what if this truth was so dangerous that it required 2,000 years of systematic suppression, distortion, and demonization to keep hidden? What timeless secret did this sealed tomb conceal, and what profound revelation awaited the one who dared to look beyond the veils of religious doctrine and historical manipulation, to perceive the delicate threads of a heritage that connected the mythical past to the transformative future? My name is Lyra, and the call to something beyond had been a persistent, almost unbearable echo within my soul since the moment I first experienced what I can only describe as genetic memory. A vision so vivid and specific that it could not have been imagination, where I saw a woman with dark hair and eyes like deep water, standing at the prow of a ship, fleeing a continent that was tearing itself apart, carrying with her not gold or jewels, but something far more precious, the encoded wisdom of a dying civilization, preserved in her very bloodline. It wasn't a voice in the conventional sense, no audible sound, but a deep, cellular knowing that pulled me towards the hidden currents of history, towards the whispers of connections that mainstream narratives dismissed as fantasy or heresy, towards the shimmering edges of reality where Mary Magdalene and Atlantis seemed to converge in ways that, once glimpsed, could never be unseen. My journey began not in any library or church, but in the bewildering experience of my own body, of abilities and knowings that I could not explain, of dreams where I spoke languages I had never learned, of visions where I recognized places I had never visited, of a sense of being connected to something ancient and vast that lived in my blood as much as in my consciousness. It was only when I began researching esoteric traditions, following threads through Gnostic texts and Cathar legends and Templar mysteries, that I encountered again and again the same suggestion, that Mary Magdalene had been more than Jesus's companion, more even than a spiritual teacher, but rather the carrier of a specific genetic lineage that could be traced back to Atlantis, a bloodline that possessed unique capacities for consciousness transformation and spiritual perception. The texts spoke of her not just as individual, but as archetype, as representative of a lineage that had survived the fall of the first civilization and had been carefully preserved, protected, and hidden, waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to reclaim its full potential. In recurring dreams, I walked beside her, not in Judea, but in a land that existed before history, learning from teachers who understood the human energy system in ways modern science was only beginning to glimpse. practices that awakened dormant capacities in the blood itself, in the DNA, in the cellular memory of what humanity had been and could be again. These visions were always accompanied by a profound sense of recognition, a knowing that I was not learning something new, but remembering something ancient, that the story of Mary Magdalene and the Atlantean bloodline was not external history, but internal truth, encoded in the very cells of those who carried the genetic heritage. It was in a restricted section of a private occult library in southern France, manuscripts that had been hidden from Inquisition fires and preserved by secret societies, that I found the text that would transform everything. The document, written in medieval Latin with annotations in what appeared to be Enochian and older scripts, carried a title that seemed to bridge impossible worlds. The Secret Lineage, How the Blood of Atlantis Survived Through the Line of the Magdalene, and Why This Knowledge Was Forbidden. The path unveiled by this extraordinary manuscript and my recurring visions was not one of comfortable intellectual exploration, but a harrowing journey into territories where genetics, archaeology, mythology, and mysticism intersected in ways that challenged every foundational assumption about human origins and potential. Each piece of evidence discovered suggesting that Mary Magdalene had indeed been part of a specific genetic lineage. Each correlation between Atlantean myths and historical mystery school traditions, each symbol found in medieval Magdalene iconography that matched nothing in Christianity but everything in older pre-flood traditions, each meditation that produced experiences of cellular memory awakening brought wave after wave of resistance, both internal and external. There was the intellectual doubt that whispered of delusion and fantasy, of conflating myth with history, of seeing patterns where there were only coincidences, of abandoning rational skepticism for dangerous magical thinking. There was the profound fear of what it meant if the story was true, if Mary Magdalene really had carried Atlantean genetics, if the suppression of her true identity was because she represented a form of human potential that threatened established power structures, if the bloodline continued to the present and those who carried it were still being tracked, controlled, or eliminated. And there was the existential terror of feeling the changes in my own body as I worked with the practices the text described, of experiencing what could only be described as DNA activation, of abilities emerging that should not be possible, of knowing things I had no normal way of knowing, external resistances manifested in ways both subtle and frightening. Academic scholars who laughed at any suggestion of Atlantis as historical reality, who dismissed Mary Magdalene's significance as wishful feminist revisionism, who refused to even consider that genetics might carry more than just physical traits. Representatives from certain organizations who seemed to appear whenever my research got too close to certain truths, who asked questions that seemed innocuous but felt like warnings, who made it clear that some areas of inquiry were unwelcome. Yet there were also unexpected allies, voices from the margins who had been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. An elderly geneticist, retired and therefore free to speak, who confided, "There are genetic markers that appear in certain lineages, markers that don't fit standard evolutionary models, markers that correlate with enhanced intuitive abilities, healing capacities, spiritual perception. Official science doesn't know what to do with them, so they're ignored. But those of us who've studied them know they're real. And yes, these markers appear in lineages that trace back through Europe to the Middle East, to families that have always claimed descent from Mary Magdalene. Is it proof? No. Is it suggestive? Absolutely. I learned through research that consumed my life that the legend of Mary Magdalene's bloodline was far older and more widespread than the modern popularizations suggested. Medieval Cathar and Templar traditions had preserved stories of her not just as mother of Jesus's children, but as carrier of a sacred bloodline that predated Christianity, that went back to Egypt, to Sumeria, to the priest kings and queens of the ancient world who possessed abilities that seemed magical, but were actually the result of carefully preserved genetics combined with initiatic training. The Grail legends, when traced to their oldest sources, spoke not just of a cup, but of a bloodline, a vessel that carried divine potential in human form. The Black Madonna icons venerated across Europe were said by some esoteric traditions to actually represent not the Virgin Mother, but the Magdalene. Her dark skin indicating her connection to ancient Egyptian and African lineages that traced back to before the flood. The climax arrived not through research, but through direct experience, a night of profound spiritual crisis and breakthrough that occurred during a pilgrimage to Sainte Marie de la Mer, the site where tradition held that Mary Magdalene had landed when she fled to France. I had been working intensively with practices described in the manuscript, meditations and visualizations designed to awaken what it called the Atlantean inheritance dormant in the blood. For weeks, I had felt increasingly strange, as if my body was changing from the inside out, as if something that had been sleeping was stirring awake. That night, in a small chapel built over far more ancient foundations, as I sat in meditation, something broke open in my consciousness, and I was no longer Lyra, no longer bound by individual identity or linear time. I experienced myself as vast, as a lineage, as a bloodline extending back through time, and I lived the memories not as observation, but as direct experience. I was in Atlantis in its final days, not the fantasy version, but a real place with real people, an advanced civilization that had achieved what we would call supernatural abilities, not through magic, but through understanding of consciousness, genetics, energy, and their intersection. I witnessed the catastrophe not as myth, but as lived trauma, felt the terror and the determination as the teachers, the keepers of the knowledge, made desperate plans to preserve what could be preserved. I saw how they selected certain individuals, those whose genetics and spiritual development made them suitable carriers, and how they encoded the wisdom not just in texts or symbols, but in the bloodline itself, in the DNA, creating a living library that could survive even if every external record was destroyed. I followed this bloodline through Egypt, through the mystery schools where the Atlantean teachings were preserved and passed on through initiatic lineages that required both genetic heritage and spiritual preparation. I watched as it moved through the ancient Near East, through the royal lines that understood they carried something sacred, something that gave them not just the right to rule, but the responsibility to serve as bridges between the human and divine. And then I was Mary Magdalene, not watching her but being her, feeling in my body the dual heritage she carried, both the genetic lineage that traced to Atlantis and the spiritual initiation that had prepared her to be the vessel for something unprecedented. I understood that her connection to Jesus was not accidental but destined, that they were two halves of an alchemical equation, that their union, whether physical or purely spiritual the texts debated, was designed to create something new, a synthesis of lineages that would birth a potential that humanity desperately needed. I felt her terror when she realized what forces were arrayed against them, not just political Rome, but something deeper. Entities that saw in this bloodline a threat to their control over human consciousness, forces that would stop at nothing to prevent this potential from flowering. I experienced her flight to France not as defeat, but as preservation, carrying in her body, whether in her womb or in her cells, the promise of a future transformation. When I finally returned to ordinary consciousness, I was lying on the cold stone floor of the chapel, my face wet with tears, my body shaking with the intensity of what I had experienced, and I knew with absolute certainty that it had not been imagination, but memory, genetic memory awakened from the depths of my own cells. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our content. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. The revelation did not bring peace, but rather a profound sense of responsibility and danger. I understood now why the truth of Mary Magdalene's bloodline had been so systematically suppressed, why she had been transformed from sacred lineage carrier to repentant prostitute, why any claim of descent from her was dismissed as fantasy or fraud. It was not just about religious doctrine or political power, though those played their parts. It was about human potential itself, about the possibility of a humanity that possessed the capacities that the Atlantean bloodline carried, capacities that would make us impossible to control, impossible to deceive, impossible to keep in ignorance and fear. The months that followed were of integration and decision. I traveled to sites associated with Mary Magdalene and with ancient mysteries, performing the practices the manuscript had described, feeling the changes in my body as what the text called junk DNA activated, as dormant capacities awakened. I experienced things that should not have been possible. Spontaneous healing, precognitive dreams that proved accurate, the ability to sense the emotional and energetic states of people around me, moments of consciousness that seemed to transcend the limitations of the individual self. I also experienced the danger, sensing when I was being watched, finding my research materials disturbed, receiving warnings both subtle and overt that some areas of inquiry were unwelcome. I understood that I was not the only one who carried this bloodline, that there were others scattered across the world, most unaware of their heritage, some beginning to awaken as the time grew right. I understood, too, that there were forces that had worked for millennia to keep this potential suppressed. Not through crude violence alone, but through subtle manipulation of culture, religion, science, creating a world where the very capacities the bloodline carried would be dismissed as impossible, where anyone who manifested them would be labeled crazy or dangerous. In the silence of my contemplation, I wrestled with what to do with what I knew. The easy path would be to remain silent, to keep the knowledge hidden as so many before me had done, to protect myself and perhaps to protect a truth that humanity might not be ready for. But I felt the pull of the lineage itself, the accumulated intention of all those who had carried it, who had suffered and died to preserve it, calling me to speak, to reveal, to take the risk. My emergence from that contemplative period was with clarity of purpose, mixed with humility about what I could actually accomplish. I would not proclaim myself as heir to some grand lineage, would not claim authority or specialness, but I would share what I had learned and experienced, offering it as invitation rather than proclamation. I began to write, carefully documenting the evidence I had found, the historical traces of the Magdalene bloodline traditions, the genetic anomalies that appeared in certain families, the practices that seemed to activate dormant capacities. I presented it not as proven fact, but as possibility worthy of serious consideration, as a lens through which to view Mary Magdalene that made sense of why her memory had been so violently suppressed. I taught workshops where I shared the practices, watching as participants experienced their own versions of awakening, their own reconnection to something ancient and potent in their cells. I created networks with others who were researching similar territories, who had their own pieces of the puzzle, who were working to understand what it meant if humanity carried in its very genetics the potential for capacities we called supernatural, but which were actually natural, merely dormant, awaiting the right conditions to flower. I understood that my role was not to prove the literal historical truth of Mary Magdalene carrying Atlantean genetics, a task likely impossible given how much had been destroyed and distorted, but to reawaken the possibility, to help those who carried the heritage, whatever its ultimate origin, to recognize and develop their capacities. I spoke of Mary Magdalene not as remote saint or historical figure, but as living archetype, as representative of a potential that dwelt in many, calling them to remember, to awaken, to step into abilities and responsibilities that had been bred out of humanity through centuries of suppression. My final work in this phase was to return to the vault beneath Rennes-le-Château, where my conscious journey had truly begun, bringing with me others who had awakened to their own bloodline heritage. And together, we performed a ceremony of remembrance and activation. As we stood in that ancient chamber, I spoke aloud what I had come to understand. Mary Magdalene, whether your story as carrier of the Atlantean bloodline is literal history or symbolic truth or some combination of both, you represent something that humanity needs desperately to remember. You remind us that we carry in our very bodies the potential for consciousness that transcends the limitations we've accepted as normal, that our genetics hold not just instructions for physical form, but encodings of spiritual capacity, that the blood itself is a library of ancient wisdom waiting to be read by those with eyes to see. You were suppressed not because you were unimportant, but because you were too important, because the truth you carried threatened systems of control that depended on keeping humanity small, limited, controllable. May all who carry the heritage, by genetics or by resonance or by choice, feel the call to awaken. May the knowledge that was preserved in bloodline and symbol and hidden text finally be reclaimed. May the potential that was seeded so long ago finally flower. The lineage is not about being special or chosen, but about being called to service, called to help humanity remember what it was and could be again. And as I spoke, I felt not just my own small self, but something vast moving through me, through all of us gathered there. And I knew that whatever the ultimate historical truth of Mary Magdalene and Atlantis, the spiritual and psychological truth was real and potent. That we carry within us capacities we have forgotten, that awakening them is both gift and responsibility, and that the time of awakening is now, whether we feel ready or not. And if you liked this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.